I wanted my books to be the next generation's Jacques Cousteau, or the generation ahead of me. They all grew up watching Mike Nelson and Sea Hunt.
Off Gassing, a Scuba podcast with host Nick Hogel. After graduating with a degree in journalism, Eric Douglas found himself enrolling in a scuba course. Like most people at the start of their scuba career, he had no idea the opportunities and memories that would be created. Countless articles across multiple publications, author of the Mike Scott thriller novels, a career in journalism that has brought him all over the world, his writing process, advice for future writers, and much more. Please enjoy as I sit down with Eric and hear his story. Eric, how are you doing this morning?
Doing great, my good friend Nick. It's the end of the year, first start of the new year. We're starting new plans and figuring out where we're going to go diving next.
Yeah. How was your holidays? I always ask because I know it could be a blessing or a curse, kind of, or both, So.
No, actually, it was very nice. Thank you. We for the first time in years, I was involved in parades and parties and all kinds of activities. So I was literally Christmas night. We'd had a couple beers with the family, that kind of thing, and I got back to my house and fell asleep in my chair for 2 solid hours. I was just worn out. No, it was very nice. How about you?
It was actually a really, really mellow year. So I was supposed to, previously when I spoke to you a few months back, I was supposed to be in Texas, but some work-related issues kept me here in Malaysia. And then my girlfriend, she actually ended up going back to spend time with family and everything. So it was a pretty mellow one, but I'm not going to complain. It was kind of nice. But she comes back this Sunday, so I got to get this weekend the house clean, and kind of was living the bachelor life, just like leaving the dishes everywhere, clothes everywhere. So
throw out the pizza boxes, yeah.
But yeah, man, I'm happy to have you back on the podcast. You joined in one of the roundtables, so I'm excited to, get the solo interview and kind of hear more about your story. First question I always like to ask is, tell me how and why you got into scuba diving. Tell me about that first breath, that first experience. What led up to that moment?
My story is probably a little different than just about anybody you've heard, because first off, I'm in West Virginia, born and raised here. I lived away for about 15 years, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So this West Virginia kid, I had just graduated with a degree in journalism from Marshall University. About nothing of note on my resume, though. But of course, at the time, I was dreaming of writing for National Geographic, like just about everybody in that situation. And I looked at my resume. I thought, okay, what could make me more appealing to National Geographic? And I thought I could learn to fly, or I could learn to scuba dive. Then I checked out the prices of learning to fly and decided to learn to scuba dive. So that's half a joke. I mean, I like everybody my age, I grew up on the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau, and it was on Sunday nights, alternating with the Wonderful World of Disney. And so, I mean, I grew up on those stories of the ocean. I've read National Geographic since I was a small child. Back then it was called National Geographic World. Now it's Nat Geo Kids. But so, I had this interest in the ocean, but I'm in a landlocked state. I'd literally only been to the ocean maybe 2 or 3 times in my life prior to learning to scuba dive. But there was this dive shop here in town, Learn to Dive. Actually, when I learned to dive with the girlfriend at the time, but I do remember my first breath. Interesting. So this was 1990. So this was a long time ago. But I do remember, like a lot of novices and people I taught to dive later, that first breath was a bit like you drop your head underwater and you go, your throat chokes for a second, and then you relax and go, oh, this works. This is cool. But Yeah, and that was in a pool, in a college pool here in town. Actually learned to dive in a local lake, like a lot of people. Learned to dive in a local lake, and actually, I made 60 dives in that lake before I ever made a dive in the ocean. It was, especially as again, recent college graduate, what I had time for, what I had money for. Couldn't make a trip to the Keys or wherever. Finally, my first ocean dives were out of Panama City, Florida.
What was the lake diving conditions like? What was the lake like?
The lake is Summersville Lake, and I still go up about every year. I still go up and make 3 or 4 dives just to blow bubbles and swim around and kind of remember where I came from. Summersville Lake, it's about 1,800 feet above sea level. So not
Oh.
serious when you're talking about altitude diving, but technically an altitude dive. But actually in summer, it's probably, July, August, it's probably 15, 20 feet of visibility. I mean, which is pretty good for a lake. It's a deep lake. If you were so inclined, I've never been because it's just cold and dark, but you can get a couple hundred feet underwater up there. I mean, I think the bottom of the lake is at about 300 feet, actually.
Oh,
Uh,
wow. Wow.
it's a flood control lake, so they basically took a river valley and dammed one end of it off. Just let it fill. Just quick side note about Summersville: West Virginia is also known for whitewater rafting. One of the big whitewater rivers flows out of that lake, so in the fall they actually drop the lake down about 80 feet to just lower it down, so for winter rain and snow and that kind of stuff. So for I think 8 or 9 weeks in the fall, they open up the spillway and the water just goes blowing out of the lake, making class 5 rapids for whitewater rafting on the other side of the lake I was just diving in. So that's the Gauley River. But yeah, it's, I mean, people come from all over the world to ride the Gauley, which is, I mean, in the fall, it's a known thing among whitewater rafters.
Yeah, I've never been whitewater rafting. It was kind of on the bucket list when I was a little bit younger, but never. Well, I kind of did once, but what are they? There's different classes. What, class 5 being the highest, right? Is that correct?
5, 6, yeah. 6 you don't go on.
Yeah. I think I maybe did like a 1 or 2. It was like a lazy float down the river,
Right.
basically.
There's another river here called the New. I've never done the Gauley in Gauley season, but the New connects to it, and I've done that. And it's 3s and 4s. It's a blast, but I'm kind of getting to the age, though. I'm not sure I want to deal with that anymore.
No, I hear you. So Panama City, you said was your first ocean dive.
First ocean dives, honestly, I don't remember a whole lot about it. A bunch of us jumped in the cars. That's about a 12-hour drive from here. It was just a long weekend, jumped in the cars, took tanks with us. We did Vortex Springs and Morrison Springs on the way in and way out. So these freshwater springs in the Florida Panhandle. Couple days of diving in Panama City. The one thing I actually do remember from Panama City was my literally first ocean dive. I was just wearing a Farmer John, so my shoulders and arms were exposed, and got just tattooed by a jellyfish. I mean, that much of a stripe
Oh.
up my. And of course, believe me, I have learned better since then. But they were spraying Windex on my arm to denature the. Yeah, I don't think this is. Like I said, I know better now, but but
Oh, that's awesome.
diving's led me. It's really funny. I mean, I've had some really great fortune by learning to dive, and some opportunities that still kind of blow my mind that I've gotten to do.
You obviously, I'm assuming, caught the bug because you worked your way all the way up through instructor. When you went to the ocean for the first time, was that just with your open water certification, or did you get your advanced by then?
Yeah, I had my advance by then in the lake, and I think I'd even taken rescue at that point. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I was a rescue diver at that point. I really had no expectation of a career in diving or of becoming an instructor. At that point, I was just this was a cool hobby, and I got to say I did something most of the rest of the world didn't do, kind of thing. But and I mean, believe me, I loved exploring the ocean, and and reading the magazines and all that. But yeah, never had a dream at that point that this was going to turn into a lifelong career. But the funny thing, you mentioned becoming an instructor, it kind of goes out of order a little bit how you might think, because it was 97, 98. I was literally on the PADI website one day, just kind of looking around, and they had a job listing. I actually had just gotten married, and this was dial-up day, so I got off the computer, went and asked my new wife, said, "What do you think about me applying for this job at PADI?" I was a dive master at the time. Or no, I was working on my dive master at the time. Long story short, I applied for this job as the associate editor of the Undersea Journal, which is PADI's professional magazine. Flew up to California, ultimately got the job. And my boss at PADI said, "You really didn't have all of the diving credentials that we were looking for." They were looking for a course director. But they said, "We like all this other stuff you've done as a writer and as a reporter and that kind of thing." So they hired me. I went to PADI. I literally, my first day at PADI, I walked in with my dive master application and handed it to the membership department for them to process. So and then I actually went through my IDC while I was a PADI employee. There's no stress there.
Yeah, that is different.
Showing up for your IE and all of the evaluators, everybody running the course, and they're looking at you like, you better pass this. No stress there at all.
So you majored in journalism. And
right.
During this time going through, the PADI courses, kind of growing your scuba career, where was the journalism? So before you applied for the PADI job, you were already on that path?
I was. I had worked as a newspaper reporter for about 4 or 5 years. Actually, not diving related, but kind of cool side story is in January of 1993. I was a local newspaper reporter, local stories, local issues kind of thing. And a friend of mine had been invited to go to Russia. This was about a year after the Soviet Union broke apart. She was leading a group of educators to go help this suburban city out of Moscow kind of restart their education program. And she looked at me, she said, "Hey, you want to go along on this trip? As documented as a reporter?" Yes, I do. And so I went in January 93, and then I went one time in the spring of 94. Then I actually quit my job and traveled to Russia for 3 or 4 months in the fall of 94. Ultimately, I've been there 7 times, just photographing and writing articles and that kind of stuff. That's one of the things that my boss at PADI said appealed to him, was all this other work I'd done, kind of the adventure work of traveling to Russia and all that.
Yeah, no, that's an amazing story.
And it was an amazing time. I believe me, I have no sympathy for what's going on in Russia right now, but I'd love to see Putin go away. But no, I met some amazing people, had some amazing experiences there. The short version of that story is in the 90s, I photographed all over the place. In 2008, I was able to go back. Actually, I went back there's at least used to be a dive show in Moscow. So I was able to work out a deal where I went back to Moscow for this dive show called the Golden Dolphin Dive Show. But I stayed a couple more weeks and re-photographed a lot of the people and places that I had photographed back in the 90s. And then 2010, I took a photo exhibit of the side-by-side pictures. It's exhibited here, but then it was also exhibited in Moscow and in Bordeaux, France.
Oh, wow. No, that's awesome. So you obviously you're a photographer. Did that kind of just start, or was that parallel when you became got into journalism?
Yeah, I learned, and I still today I say I shoot like a journalist. It's kind of on the fly, shooting people in faces and things going on. I learned photography in college as part of my journalism degree, and I was trained as a writer, but I learned photography, black and white, darkroom photography, and all that back in school. So that was my journalism career, was both as a local newspaper reporter and photographer, just doing everything I could. When you're in your 20s, you're just excited to be alive and involved in everything you get your hands on. It worked out well when I was hired at Patty. They said, you've got all this other experience is what we're looking for. So that appealed to them.
Yeah, yeah. So tell me a little bit about the time at Patty. So I'm assuming you moved out to California.
Moved to California, and actually, it was a fantastic experience. That's literally in everybody's office, not everybody, but there were scuba tanks laying around, and there were every discussion you had in the hallway had something to do with diving. When I moved out there, Patty has a pool actually in their backyard of their offices in California. I moved out there 6 months before we moved into that building, so I was in the old building and then moved into the new building. We were literally allowed as staff. And I told you I went through my IDC there at Patty. We were literally allowed as staff to train people to scuba dive, especially staff, other staff, if they weren't divers already. We were encouraged to teach them in the backyard pool. There were tanks, there was an air compressor, the whole deal. So it was all about diving. Every day was a learning environment. But actually, one of the cool things I did when I lived in California, which led to the next step in my career, I learned about the position of diving medic, DMT, diver medic technician. It just so happened if you became an EMT and then took a course over on Catalina Island with the hyperbaric chamber there, they would certify you as a DMT. So a buddy and I went through all the training and became DMTs right about the time we were both becoming instructors. Actually, he and I went through this program and became diver medics while we were in California. Patty had a weird schedule at the time. I don't know if they still do or not, where you had every other Friday off. Every other Friday we're doing ocean dives out or running over to Catalina Island. It was an amazing time for diving. Actually, I often say that I feel more like a California diver than anything else. I did my West Virginia lake dives. I've done Florida, but I think I really cut my teeth and really grew up as a diver in the kelp forests off of Catalina Island and Shaw's Cove and Laguna Beach, and then out of San Diego and those kinds of places.
Oh no, that's awesome. That's the kelp forest is a place that I've wanted to visit for a long time. But just quick question. Tell me about the process of like becoming a DMT. So you basically just go through the process of becoming an EMT. Now you're a DM, so they just kind of merge it, or is there some cross training there? I would assume. Yeah.
There's an additional level of training, and I think they've changed I think you actually have to be a paramedic now. Back then they had two levels. They had an EMT B and then this additional training course. But I think it may be just paramedics now. I don't recall exactly. I haven't heard exactly. But yeah, back then anyway, we became EMT Bs, EMT Basics, which is a 120-hour course or something like that. And then we took another, there's usually a DMT course. In this case, there was a course that's called EDAM, Emergency Diving Accident Management, out at Catalina Island. And by completing those two things, you met all the requirements for the DMT certification. At least back then, again, this was 20-something years ago, we were able to apply and become DMTs, which was great. At Catalina Island, that's an all-volunteer chamber, or there's one paid staff, and the rest of them are everybody else is volunteers. So you go out and spend weekends or hang out during the week. And if an accident comes in, you're on duty to treat an injured diver, which I did a couple times. I didn't do a lot, but I did a couple times. While I was at Patty about 2 years and went through all this, and then I kind of came to the attention of some people at DAN, at Divers Alert Network, and I was hired to DAN, ultimately end up in the training department. Part of my job was revising and updating DAN first aid training programs.
How did you find that? Was that also based in California?
No, Dan is in North Carolina. So, it was a cool opportunity, and I was there almost 12 years. When I left, I was the director of training for Dan. Yeah, they're in North Carolina, affiliated with Duke University. So, I said I really felt like I cut my teeth as a diver in California. But one of the coolest parts about my job at Dan is they sent me all over the world teaching other dive instructors and other dive instructor trainers how to teach the Dan courses. So, and of course, when you're traveling to Grand Cayman to go teach a class, you might sneak in the water for a dive or four, you make the schedule just so that you've got time for morning boat dives before you teach in the afternoon. So,
That sounds rough, man. That sounds rough.
it was a tough gig. Dan was another one of those great learning experiences. I actually set up with Dr. Peter Bennett and I. Dr. Bennett was the founder of Dan. Working with Dr. Bennett, we actually created and taught a DMT course there, but the Dan Oxygen first aid for hazardous marine life injuries, going back to that jellyfish sting on my arm. Those courses were there before I got there, but I ended up revising and I'm updating them. We created an AED course. Again, just a tremendous learning experience for me, being able to delve into the first aid and safety side, which I'd learned about as an EMT and DMT. So, it all just kind of came together.
Yeah. So where was the photojournalism at this time? Did it kind of take a step back? Obviously you're writing for Dan, but are you still kind of writing on the journalism side of things?
As a journalist, I was still a very regular contributor. At this point, I was still regular contributor to Alert Diver magazine. Probably that was a monthly magazine at the time. It's quarterly now, but it's a monthly magazine at the time. Yeah, I was probably writing 8 to 10 magazine articles a year at that time for Dan. About 2003, I'd been at Dan a couple years, and a buddy and I, Steve Barnett, were in Grand Cayman teaching a class. He was a sales rep, so he was visiting all the dive shops. And I was down there teaching a class for the instructors and instructor trainers on the island. And Steve had been a photo pro on the island, so he was kind of taking me around and showing me things. And he showed me this area of what they call, it's coral that's exposed. He was showing me blowholes where the waves come in and blow straight up through the coral fixtures. But this is all exposed coral up out of the water, and it's black. And it just looks like hell, because there's a wide spot in the road on Grand Cayman Island that's called Hell, and they actually have a post office there. But it's all this exposed coral, and it's jagged and rough. And I remember at the time thinking, if I fell while walking out across this stuff, I would probably bleed to death. And then my imagination kicked in, and I went, what would make a person so afraid that they ran across this? And so, I just started daydreaming and kind of imagining. That ended up being the very first scene I wrote in my very first novel, which is called Cayman Cowboys. The funny thing is now that scene is about a third of the way into the book. But so I wrote this whole scene of this girl being terrified and running across Iron Shore is what they call it, running across this exposed coral, and then had to go back and write the chapters leading up to getting her so terrified that she ran across this. And that, like I said, that ended up being my first book, was published in 2004, which was Cayman Cowboys. And it's a thriller novel set on Grand Cayman.
Did you always have goals to want, like, I'm assuming, just being a journalist, like, I want to write a book one day, or did just that idea just kind of spawn like, I like what I'm thinking. I like where this story is going. I need to put this down on paper, and then it grew from there?
I can answer that two ways. One is it just kind of grew. I don't know that I ever imagined myself. I was an avid reader. At that point, I was reading everything from Clive Cussler. But in my 20s and 30s, I grew up reading Tom Clancy. And that's definitely, those are two kind of people I've modeled my own writing after. And here goes the National Geographic connection again. Once, as a newspaper reporter, I had the opportunity to interview the man who was at the time the chairman of the Grants and Exploration Committee for Nat Geo. Really fascinating guy. This was about the time I was traveling to Russia too. But, of course, after we've done the interview, he was in town giving a presentation. So after we'd finished the interview, I said, so, what's it take for somebody like me to get to work for National Geographic? And he said, well, we don't hire just anybody. But so the best thing to do is go make a name for yourself, writing for magazines, writing a book or two, and I kept that advice in my head. So I knew I was going to write a book at some point. I don't think I ever planned to write fiction based on that, but whatever works. But yeah, I was writing for magazines and doing everything I can and learning at every opportunity. Again, for the record, I've still never written for National Geographic, but I've had a fun career. I've had a really cool career. It just never quite reached that.
If they came knocking tomorrow, would you jump on it?
In a moment. just like when I was asked if I wanted to go to Russia. Yes.
So the writing process began, you put out your first book. Did you catch the bug for writing fiction and kind of wanting to go down that path more?
Absolutely. And the first book, so my books are average 80, 85, 90,000 words now. The first book was only about 72,000 words, I think. But the funny thing is the first draft of the first book was about 30,000 words. So I had this great story that I thought in my head. And then I realized once I got it done, I was like, I forgot to include any of the bad guys. So it was a whole learning process. I had to go back and rewrite entire chapters and do all this kind of stuff. And I learned a lot from that process. That a lot of writers would take that first book and put it in a drawer and it would never see the light of day. But I thought, let's get it out there. And it's been extremely well received and still gets positive reviews 20 years later. Actually, or 2005 is when it was published, come to think of it. But I absolutely caught the bug. And one of the things I decided when I started writing the books was I wanted, I'm in the dive industry. I've been in the industry for 6-7 years at this point. I mean, full-time in the dive industry at that point. And I wanted to use this as a way I wanted my books to be the next generation's Jacques Cousteau. Or the generation ahead of me, they all grew up watching Mike Nelson and Sea Hunt. I was hopeful that my books would excite a new generation of people to both care about the ocean and probably learn to dive as well. So I try to keep the diving as realistic as possible. I don't know that there's any dives with special training, of course, but there's no dive that any of the readers couldn't actually do themselves. There's no 500-foot dives on a half a tank of air kind of thing. It's all realistic. And I'm also of the generation who grew up watching Baywatch, and they inevitably had all these. They were down underwater for half an hour on a half-filled pony bottle or a spare air or something, and it's like, just no, just stop. So, I try to make my dive as realistic as possible. And, but at the same time, I want people to read it and go, that's cool. I wonder if I could do that. And, go to their dive shop and learn to dive.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. And to be honest, to my knowledge, for some of the stuff that I've seen, I definitely feel that Hollywood still doesn't really get it right with some of the movies that are out there. It's just like, this is complete. I mean, to somebody that doesn't dive, they might be like, oh, that's kind of cool. But there was a movie I watched the other day where they had like really nice equipment, but then it was just some wild notions. It was like a haunted house under the water in Switzerland or something. I can't remember. It was entertaining, but
yeah,
there's some moments.
You have to suspend your diver from those kind of things and just, all right, fine, whatever.
Just a random question because I'm curious. So when you're writing an article or a book, you kind of put it out there as like the first you put 30,000 words or 70,000 words. When you're writing a book, is that kind of how you're gauging it? Like it has to be so many words, not so many pages. I don't know if that question kind of if it makes sense.
I mean, I know, and I think that's pretty consistent. 75 to 90,000 words is a pretty typical thriller novel. That's about 300 pages or so. I mean, that's kind of my target. A lot of, right now where I am working full time, 1,000 to 1,500 words is actually a pretty decent writing day. That's an hour or two, but if you're working a full time job, that's about all you get elsewise. There was a period after I left Dan that I was doing nothing but freelancing and consulting and that sort of thing. And I'd get 2,000, 2,500 words in. And that's kind of or if you're on a real downhill slide at the end of the book, you might get 4,000 words. But very few people can keep up that pace for very long. So you figure a 90,000 or even, an 80,000 word book, it's going to take several months to just hammer out the first draft. And that doesn't count research and all that either, too. So.
Yeah. So when you're writing, so you have this idea, you start putting words down, because so like sometimes like because I've wanted to write, and sometimes I'll write articles, and I usually put it out there, like I'll write something and then it goes in the electronic trash bin because I'm writing on a computer, obviously not throwing it in the actual trash bin. But I feel like sometimes I'll get held up on misspellings, or if I'm not saying it correctly. Do you just kind of let it flow, go back, and then re-edit it? Is that kind of your is that a process, or like
That is a process. That's also my process. And I tell you what, that goes back very much to my journalism training. We were taught literally to think into a keyboard. You kind of formed an outline in your mind, and then you wrote your lead, and the story just followed as you're going back and forth from notes, whatever. And that's really how I still write today. Now I'll have an outline. I know what I want to say. I have a general idea with my books, what I want and expect to happen, and then I just start writing. And yeah, the first draft is, you expect it to be trash, and you expect to go back and change quite a bit, or I missed this, or whether it's a magazine article or whether it's a book. I'm a little stuck at the moment, but I'm on what will be now the 12th novel in my primary series, which is the Mike Scott series. But I haven't gone back and read any of the previous chapters. I mean, I've written about a third of it. I'm at 25,000 words, but I haven't gone back and read any of it. I have an outline moving forward, and I'll hammer that out, and then I'll go back through and reread it and start editing and start marking up and making changes back through the process. And whether that's 1,000-word article or 2,000-word article or a 80,000 word book, it's just kind of the same thing. I think into the computer now. Again, I'm a little older than you. Back when I was learning journalism, it was thinking into a typewriter, and you just type into the keyboard, you think into the keyboard, and then go back and edit.
Okay. Well, I sorry, I just have like many questions now, but just a real quick one. Do you sometimes miss the typewriter? I know some people like they prefer, or they'll want to write on a typewriter. Or do you just kind of like out with the old?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I've had people link me. I guess there's a typewriter feel keyboard that you can hook up to your computer, but it feels like a typewriter with the longer keystrokes. Yeah, no, I want to touch type. I don't want to. It's too much like work.
Yeah. Two questions. I want to talk more about the Mike Scott series and how that kind of came about and how you push that forward. And then you had just mentioned about getting stuck, and just we always hear about like the writer's block. So how do you overcome that? So whichever one you want to answer first, but because I'm just kind of curious.
Mike Scott in general. Mike Scott, like I said, there's 11 books in the series and a few random short stories and everything else. Like I said earlier, there's two things. I really intended it to be a way to engage. I wanted it to be the next Mike Nelson in Sea Hunt. I wanted people reading it to go, hey, I want to learn to dive and be just like Mike Scott. I don't know that I ever expected there would be 11 books in this series either, right? I wrote the one, and then I wrote another one, and then I had an idea for a third, and it's really just kind of grown. I think after about the third, I realized this is going to continue to be a pretty big series for me. But, and just a quick side note, Mike Scott is named for one of my best friends in high school and college died of cancer at about 21, 22 years of age. He was a year older than I was, but his name was Mike Scott Burnsworth, Michael Scott Burnsworth. When I decided to start writing the book about 15 years later after he died, there was no question in my mind that was going to be the character's name for the book. This is my way of memorializing him or immortalizing him, and then imagining what his life could have been had he lived, had he not died of cancer. It's just kind of grown and expanded, and fortunately, again, when I was working for Dan, they did send me all over the place. All that travel, all that dive travel, became location research for my books. So literally, the books go from Grand Cayman to Southern California to Italy, North Carolina, and Cuba, to Mexico, back to Grand Cayman, Curacao, then to Florida Keys, then to I set a challenge for myself to tell a story entirely on board a boat. So Turks and Chaos is set entirely on board a boat. They never touch land. The 10th book is Water Crisis. That one goes from Russia to the Bahamas to Miami. And then the 11th book starts in North Carolina and is off the coast of Mexico and a little bit onshore in Mexico. Granted, it's more kind of Caribbean Atlantic based, except for Flooding Hollywood, but it bounces all over the place and takes readers to places they may never been before.
Is it all in a linear timeline? Is that the right way to put it?
No,
Where
you
it's,
can read
like
books
the
out of
first book
order.
starts. No, like, so I meant, like, does like the first book start in 96, second 98, or will one? How sometimes the story will be like, oh, we're gonna go back to before the first book, kind of like a Star Wars maybe.
No. They are linear. There's no jumping back and forth. They're written. You can read them out of order, but they don't date themselves by jumping back and forth. It's funny. The first 3 books, I didn't reuse any of the characters. Starting in about the 4th and 5th books, I started bringing back in characters I'd used in previous stories, and by the 6th through the end so far, there's a lot more character crossover. Like with the 6th book, you don't have to have read it, but if you've read the 3rd book, you'll recognize a character from that comes forward. So that kind of thing, I did use some to bring a little continuity through the later stories. You write a character and you go, hey, this character's cool. I want to reuse it.
Are you having fun character building with some of the non-main characters?
I do. I tell you what, the thing I struggle with most, and we'll get back to your other question in a second. The thing I struggle with most is naming characters for some reason. You'd think it'd be relatively easy, and there are name generators and all kinds of stuff. Kind of my first rule is don't come up with any terribly unusual names, because you might have to type that 50 times. So you really don't want to, some odd spelling that you mangle every time. No, it's not worth the headache. I just struggle with coming up with character names. I can come up with quirky characters, but character names I struggle with for some reason. It ends up being often names of people I know show up in as characters in my books. I'll steal names of people I know. So there may be a Nick. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, no, that would be. I would love that. That would be awesome. When you do that, do you build the character kind of with the person that you know in mind, like just subconsciously or consciously?
More subconsciously. Officially, none of these people represent real people. That whole disclaimer at the front of the book. But yeah, there's probably been a few characters in my books patterned after living human beings.
We'll just make Nick a wonderful podcast host, maybe a radio host. There you go. So yeah, the writer's block question. How do you combat that?
In this case, I typically distract myself for a while. I'll shift to a different project for a little while. Shift gears and go work on a short story or something else different, and then come back to the story. I don't try to force through it. Now, there's a lot of writers and a lot of writing advice. There's a lot of really bad writing advice out there, actually, but there's a lot of writing advice out there that says, you have to get your butt in the seat every day. And that's true. A book's not going to write itself. You have to make it. You have to dedicate time and sit down and write it. I think with this story, the reason I'm a little stuck is, and I've done like I said, everything's really location based. And I set a portion of the book in a place I don't know very well. And I'm struggling with describing the locations, that sort of thing. But it dawned on me just a few days ago that it would actually be just as convenient or just as a convincing story if I moved that setting to a place I know better, that I think I'll feel more comfortable with. So, it's been the holidays. I've taken a little breather anyway. But after the first year, my plan is to go back and reread it from the beginning and probably go ahead and start doing some editing. But I'm going to start making those edits to change that location. I'd set it around Jacksonville, Florida, and I've been to Jacksonville. I just don't know the area all that well. So I think I'm going to actually move it up into North Carolina. My character, Mike Scott, has a home on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Jumps on a plane and travels all over the world, but his home base is on the beach in North Carolina. I think that will break me out of this. Is starting going back, reading it, and going ahead and doing that edit on the first third of the book, but also so that'll get my mind spinning about what else I need to change, where what I need to write from there forward. But then it'll break out of that. I don't know that there's an easy one way answer to how to break out of writer's block, though. You just got to do what you got to do.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm sure it's like anything, a different process for every individual. My last question I will throw out at you, kind of just something that you just said, and from your experience and in your history, you've done some pretty cool stuff. You had just mentioned that there's a lot of bad writing advice out there. So what is a piece of good advice? Maybe for somebody like me who kind of wants to start writing, for me to say like, oh, I would love to be in a magazine article would be absolutely amazing. The idea is so far out there for me though, but just somebody that wants to kind of start getting into that, what advice would you have for them?
Think about what hasn't been told, whether it's a book or whether it's a magazine. But the approach is obviously going to be different, whether you're writing for a commercial magazine, whether you're writing something literary, whether writing, I don't consider my books literary, but, thriller, action kind of thing. So you really have to understand your genre. If you want to be a magazine contributor or on staff at a magazine, if you want to write for a magazine, know the magazine and what they talk about. So stylistically, you have to understand the stories they're telling. And so read. The biggest thing is read where you want to go. In my case, I've read thousands of thriller novels, and moving from newspapers to magazines wasn't a huge challenge for me. But again, I had to understand the magazine style, the things that they wanted to talk about. Back to the Undersea Journal, was, I don't even know if they're still publishing it or not anymore, to be honest with you. But that was a magazine just for PADI professionals. They were always talking about, I don't care if you're doing a travel article for the magazine, you were still talking about standards and teaching and what to do as an instructor, what to do as a dive master if you're going to visit those kinds of places. Or, we were talking advice about teaching and all that kind of thing all the time. So you have to understand the audience of the magazine before you even start writing anything. Then reach out and see if they're interested in the story pitches, and then just go for it. You write an outline, you refine it about 6 times. You write the story, you refine that about 6 times. And then you cut 1,000 words back out of it because you got a little too verbose, and then submit it.
No, I like that too. I really do, because it's me. Like I'll go to like maybe 1 edit, 2 edits, then I'm like, no, it's good. So it's kind of nice to know that it's not just a one and done. Obviously, I knew it wasn't one and done, but it's a multiple step process to get to that finished product.
For one of my books, so I'll write the book, I'll read it, and what I usually do, I write it on my laptop. I use a software called Scrivener, but I write it on my laptop. I'll export it and then read it on a tablet, because it's just a different format, the different line length, everything else. Things look different on a tablet. So I'll usually read it on a tablet and make notes, go back into the laptop, make edits, revisions, whatever. There may be one more round on my computer, and then I'll send it out to a group of very loyal beta readers I have, who will then make edits. I'll send copies of it to 8-10 people who will make edits. I'll incorporate all those edits, and then I will probably do one more final round of read it. And then in that time I'll then print it out. So again, it looks different, it feels different. You can catch typos, you can catch mistakes. And even with the beta readers, it's amazing to me when I'm going through their edits. One person catches this but misses this, but a second person caught this thing. So you can't just have one editor unless you hire a professional editor who's literally going line by line, which is a good thing too. But for any of my books, there's probably 5 or 6 rounds of edits on a full book.
Okay, well, Eric, I really, really appreciate you coming to the podcast today. This has been absolutely wonderful, and it's been absolutely amazing to hear about your journey.
Nick, I appreciate you having me.
Offgassing, a Scuba podcast.